Hello, everyone. This is going to be 7.1 Founding a Nation. This is going to be going from the creation of the Articles of Confederation during the American Revolution all the way up through founding the new Constitution after the American Revolution is over. So, we're going to start with a quote from James Madison in Federalist 51, where he said, "In framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So we're going to take a look at how we try to do that with both of these new ideas. So after the American Revolution was over, America was a very young country. Obviously, we were newborn, and we had a lot of problems. The first one partially being that we had so much land, all this new territory, but very little in the way of governing it or controlling it. We had very little army. We had very little lawmaking, and also we had very few cities too. We were mostly rural with a few big cities in place, and we were surrounded by France and Spain and England, and some of these guys were not our number one fans. There were also a lot of competing claims over who had the most power in this new form of government that we were creating. Is it going to be the states having the most power, or is it going to be the national government of having the most power? And really, the question becomes: you have a blank piece of paper. What are you going to do with this new country? You can do anything. You can go anywhere. In the words of King George III, what comes next? So, our first shot was the Articles of Confederation. This was our first attempt at a sort of written series of laws, or sort of a written sort of guidebook for our country, a how-to manual for our country. It was written in 1777 and finally adopted by all the states in 1781. And in a lot of ways, it is the sort of constitution that you would expect from a country that is at war, from a country that feels it's been oppressed, and from a country that's very worried about establishing a new dictatorship. It is a country that gives very little power to the centralized government. It did have power over all 13 states, but not a whole lot of power. It was basically a loose coalition, or as they called it in their own terms, a firm league of friendship. The states maintained a huge amount of self authority and independence from the other states, and were really only called upon to be a country in times of war, basically. Other than that, most of the time the power was within the states. Almost think of it like having 13 small countries that banded together in order to defend each other. It's almost like the European Union in a way. So here is the actual document of the Articles of Confederation. You can tell right at the top, instead of "we the people," it's almost like an anonymous letter. It says "to whom it may concern," instead of "we the people." Now, under the Articles of Confederation, first of all, there's no president and no executive branch. There's also no national judiciary, so that's two out of three of the branches of government that we have today not in the picture. There was a Congress, but and you could send multiple delegates to that Congress. However, in the end, when it came time to vote for something, every state had just one vote. So tiny little Rhode Island, where only 5 people lived, had the same amount of power in the Articles of Confederation as big and mighty Virginia. And also, this government couldn't do a lot. They could declare war, they could make peace. They didn't have an army, though, and they could not create taxes. So basically, states had to volunteer to give donations, which guess how often they did that, especially at a time when everybody is broke because we're fighting a revolution. Now, in order to pass something, it was not just a 50-50 or 51-49, I guess, vote in order to pass a law. If you wanted to pass a law, it took 9 out of 13 states to say yes to it, which rarely happened. It also took 13 out of 13 states to actually change the Articles of Confederation. This never happened thanks to Rhode Island. Rhode Island liked the fact that they were just as powerful as other big nations, and so they never really changed stuff. So, in the end, the Articles made it impossible to have a strong and centralized government, which is exactly what they were trying to do. They were really trying not to have a large centralized government. However, as we found out, sometimes you do need one, and when you don't have one, it leads to problems. However, they did do a few things during their time. So the articles lasted for really under a decade, from about 1781 to 88. They did pass a few laws saying that the national government would establish control of all the new lands in the West, which was important because we at first people were like, okay, so Virginia, the state of Virginia, is just going to go west until we hit the Mississippi River. So imagine like having a bunch of short little states with huge long areas going west. Instead, we decided we're going to break all that territory in the West up into new states instead. Basically, those 13 states would not stretch all the way to the Mississippi River. So here we see that originally, the states that were the original 13 states did sort of plan that they would have all that land to the west. However, they eventually gave it up after they realized that was just not going to work. I don't know how Virginia decided they got Wisconsin, but I don't know. Anyway, so Americans, when they spoke of the West, we're talking about the West right now, they talked about it almost like it was this empty land waiting for them to take it over. However, it was not empty. In fact, there were over 100,000 Native Americans already living there, along with a bunch of Spanish people. So Congress basically said that these Native Americans, since they had sided with the British during the Revolution, this was not 100% true, by the way, because several of them had sided with the Americans. But Congress said that since the natives had sided with the British, they had lost their ownership of this western land. They had sort of lost the right to it. Native tribes were forced to sign a bunch of treaties with the new United States, the first one being called the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784. That's the biggest one that everybody remembers. These treaties gave up most of their land, although the U.S. government, did promise them that any remaining land that they held on to would belong to them, and we promised. So of course we would never like go back on that or anything like that. Anyway, so after the Treaty of Paris, we see settlement of the West happening at a huge fast rate, almost immediately. Many of them didn't even wait for like permission from the government; they just headed out. They just moved onto the land, and this was a problem because we didn't want it done pell-mell. We didn't want it done halfway, and we didn't want it done so that houses are just popping up and streets are winding into curlicues and things like that. So we were worried. Congress was worried about people just squatting on the land. People were worried about starting fights with Native American tribes if they settled on land that wasn't theirs. And Congress was very worried about making it disorderly and making it uninviting. So in order to make sure that we settle this land correctly, Congress passed several what we call land ordinances. First of all, the Ordinance of 1784 divided up the land into districts, and these districts were owned for the moment by Congress. However, once they became settled and once they became organized, once they had enough people in their population, enough voters, they could write a state constitution, send it off to Congress, Congress could approve, and you could become a state. That is exactly the way we do it today with any new territories that we might have. If any of them become states, that's how it happens. The Ordinance of 1785 actually doled out these states into 1 mile squares. So basically, almost think of it like you take a cheese grater and you cut them up into little 1 mile squares, and then they would sell these little 1 mile squares to create towns. So here's the Land Ordinance of 1785. As you can see in this little subdivision of Ohio, you divide it up into 1 mile squares. Now think about it, this requires somebody to basically walk the land as a surveyor and measure out how many miles it is. And eventually, you divide it up into little 1 square mile townships. You sell off the property to farmers and to stores and towns and things like that. You also notice that there is one little section set aside and reserved for public schools. That is because they wanted to make sure that people out there did get some kind of education. Now, dividing up the land like this hit a problem when it realized that, once again, some people had already just moved west and already, claimed it. And so it was not going to be as neat and easy as possible. Also, the big problem is that most Americans could not afford to buy it, even though they were giving it out pretty cheaply. Most of the land was gobbled up by big land companies, and the land companies would sell it off bit by bit to Americans. So it was not the government selling it off, it was companies selling it off. The first time we see real cheap land out west is going to be in 1863 with the Homestead Act. Now, finally, we also passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. This created several states within what is called the Old Northwest Territory. So, again, this is the idea of we're not going to create colonies, we're going to create territories that are on their way to becoming states. According to our new Constitution, which we haven't quite gotten to yet, the new Constitution actually said, we're not going to have colonies. Colonies or territories are just basically a transitioning thing as we move into having states. And this Northwest Ordinance promised to respect the land of native tribes. It also banned slavery from the Northwest Territory as well. And this is going to be important when we sort of see this dividing line start to form across the country with slave states and free states. All of the Northwest Territory states that we see here are going to be free states. And as we see here also, these are the years that they came into the United States, the last one being Minnesota in 1858. Now, despite all these ordinances, this new government was very weak, especially when it came to money. And money is important because money is how you basically run your country. America was broke. We had paid for the revolution through a lot of IOUs to other big countries. We had borrowed large sums of money from the French and from the Spanish and from the Dutch. And suddenly, we had to pay those back, and we couldn't because we couldn't collect taxes. And so we were in a real big problem because, every time we were like, hey, somebody pass a new tax to make sure that we can pay this money back, it would fail. That new tax would fail. Also, we were not able to trade with the people in the Caribbean because most of the people in the Caribbean were British colonies. And for some reason, they didn't like us very much right after the American Revolution. So in order to pay off these debts, the states, and it was state by state, so it wasn't like the United States owed money to Spain, it was like Massachusetts owed money to Spain. And so the states started to print off paper money, and they tried to impose state taxes on foreign goods. These are two things the states cannot do today. Other states would postpone the collection of taxes, saying, yeah, I'll give you another year to pay off this tax, which is great, until finally you put the hammer down and you say, okay, you've got to pay this back now. And suddenly these states are finding that people are very rebellious when you go to them and say that, okay, it's time to pay this back, or else we'll start taking over your land, we'll start seizing your property. A lot of these guys just fought a war to make sure that they could hold on to their property. And so there was a danger that Western citizens, many of them veterans, would resist this taxation, and that is exactly what happened. And it happened in Massachusetts. From 1786 to 1787, Massachusetts tried to crack down and collect all these taxes that they'd been sort of letting go by the wayside for years. In response to this, the farmers, led by a former Revolutionary War captain named Daniel Shays, rebelled against the state troops. And the state troops had to come out and force them to reopen the local courts so that they could be punished for not paying their taxes. And this became known as Shays' Rebellion. Eventually, Shays' Rebellion was put down, but a lot of other states in the United States were like, wow, if that could happen in Massachusetts, it could happen here too. It could happen in Virginia. It could happen in Georgia. It could happen wherever. So it really did show the weakness of this new government. We couldn't collect taxes because that was a state issue. We didn't have an army to put down rebellions, which is going to be a problem if there's another Daniel Shays. And so eventually a group decided to form, calling for sort of a touching up of the Articles of Confederation. So here's Daniel Shays, either on the left or on the right. I'm not sure which is him, but Daniel Shays was around from 1747 to 1825. He was from Massachusetts. He had been a captain during the American Revolution, and he had tried during his rebellion to seize an arsenal. However, it was broken up when the Massachusetts militia came out in a larger force than him, and a few of his men died, a few of their men died, but it was a pretty quick rebellion. He was later captured. Some of his men were hanged, but most of them were pardoned, including Daniel Shays. And Shays lived the rest of his life very peacefully in upstate New York on a farm. Now, two of the strongest advocates for creating a national government were James Madison from Virginia and Alexander Hamilton from New York. Now, this is an important moment because usually this is pretty much the last time you're going to see these two guys on the same side of any argument. But they both said we need a stronger federal government. This Articles of Confederation is just not doing the trick. Their arguments found some allies in some of the states, not all the states. Mainly, a lot of the people who favored this stronger national government were people in big cities, wealthier merchants who wanted to do international trade but couldn't due to our poor economy, or people who thought that we would do better with a big country and not 13 small states. So think of it as almost the idea of people who would say, we want one big country, not a bunch of little states. And in 1786, delegates from the 6 states met in Annapolis, Maryland. There were only 6 that showed up, so 7 didn't even show up for this. And they talked about it for a little while, and they said, well, let's talk about it again next year. And in May of 1787, the delegates from even more states showed up in Philadelphia, first with the idea of changing the Articles of Confederation, and then they had the goal of just tossing them out and starting from the top. So here's James Madison, 1751 to 1836. He's from Virginia. He was a lawyer. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Later on, he becomes a congressman from Virginia. He becomes Secretary of State. And later on, he'll become President of the United States. Now, he was at the Constitutional Convention. He was one of the guiding forces of it. He was technically, though, not the secretary, although he just sort of nominated himself to do so, which is good. He took voluminous notes on the Constitutional Convention, which is great because the guy who was our secretary didn't do a great job. And so Madison basically kept really good, meticulous notes, and he released them upon his death. This later gave him the nickname the Father of the Constitution. And we have Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804. He is from St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean. He was a soldier during the Revolutionary War. He was a delegate from New York to the Constitutional Convention, and under Washington became the first Secretary of Treasury. He once actually, during this Constitutional Convention, called for a brand new government where the president would be a lifetime appointment, basically president for life. And you could tell he was sort of looking directly at George Washington as he made this plan. However, nobody said yes to it. Everybody just ignored that he was even talking, basically. And in the end, after his time in office as Secretary of the Treasury, he was killed in a duel with Mr. Aaron Burr, Sir. And so, yes, we all had to see this one coming. I'd apologize, but, I'm not sorry about it. Yeah,